Hades 1 is one of my favorite games, period. Along with most other Supergiant Games stuff, to be honest. And so far, the worst part about the game is that I just want to keep playing more, but I don't want to burn myself out before its full release. Hades 2 is very similar to the first game, but it also cleverly inverts some things, like how the first game has you playing as a snarky bottom trying to get on top, while Hades 2 has you trying to play as serious top, frantically trying to get to the bottom. And the top, it likes to switch things up. The game makes a bunch of small but confident changes that make it feel familiar but still distinguishes itself from its predecessor. For one, you can no longer dash everywhere. The cooldown between dashes is much longer, but in its place you get a sprint. If you hold down the button after your dash, you'll go into a sprint, allowing you to avoid attacks. This means you have to think way more about your movement, far more than the first game, because you can't just spam dash attacks and abuse the iframes to get out of sticky situations anymore, making movement feel far more methodical than the first game. There were so many times where Hades 1 muscle memory would kick in, and I'd dash into enemies to make use of that powerful dash attack, expecting to immediately dash out to safety, only to immediately eat shit because I forgot about the cooldown. You also don't really have a light and heavy attack anymore. You have your basic attack, and what would have normally been a heavy attack has been replaced, in most cases, with a range attack. In fact, every weapon has a range attack now, and most of the weapons in early access are focused on range, which fits the game's magic and witchcraft theme more. The first weapon you get is basically a wizard staff. Its basic attack is a mid to short range blast, and it can shoot out a long range attack like your cast from Hades 1. The knife and sickle weapon allows you to throw the knife, the axe has a block, but even that turns into a range attack if you hold it long enough. All the weapons felt really good to use and distinct from one another, each one requiring a different playstyle to use. But the only weapon I wasn't crazy about was the axe. Ironic considering I got my first win with it, so it's clearly not bad, it's just that it's so slow and takes so long to recover from a swing that even though Hades 2 is slower in general than its predecessor, it never felt safe to take a swing with it. Hades 2 is also way more focused on range combat, making it that much harder to close the gap. Its special is weird too, it's a block, but if you hold it too long, you start to charge a powerful range attack, which is cool, but it also means if you block for too long, you can get stuck in a lengthy animation where you just take even more damage. I don't know, I feel like the axe just needs something, but maybe it's just not to my playstyle. Every attack now also has an Omega version, which basically just means you charge up the attack for big damage. For the cost of a new resource, magic. These attacks don't just hit harder either, they change what the attack actually does. For example, it changes the basic attack for the staff into a long range attack that hits everything in a row on either side of you, and its range attack gets turned into an explosive bolt. So they aren't there just for more damage, but more like a new tool in your belt that can make up for a weapon's deficiencies. They give a precision weapon some crowd clear, a melee weapon some range, or bear single target damage when lacking. But you have to charge them up, making yourself vulnerable in the process, and you need to carefully manage your magic meter. You also now use Arcana cards to upgrade your character instead of the mirror in Hades 1 where progression was a little bit more linear. Arcana cards require 0 to 5 grasp to equip, and your grasp is limited to 10 at first, but you can upgrade it later on. So of course the more powerful cards require more grasp, but there are also 0 cost cards which actually require you to fulfill certain criteria to activate them, like have all the cards in one row equipped at once, or have no more than 3 cards with the same amount cost, etc. So you really have to think about your load order way more. Which cards can you equip? How much do they cost? If I equip this one, will it mess up the criteria for that powerful 0 cost card? And finally, even your cast is different. Since every weapon has a range attack now, your cast takes the form of AoE slow for crowd control. I barely used the cast in Hades 1, I have to admit, but here it was so useful to just drop my cast to stop crowds of enemies from overwhelming me, or put some space between me and the faster enemies. I used it all the time here, so the combat has way more diversity to it. And the game really wants and encourages you to use everything at your disposal, and you see this especially through the enemy and encounter design, where a lot of them will either try to pepper you with range, or their attack makes it difficult to get close to them, making range attacks an easy counter, or some enemies will quickly and aggressively pursue you, or try to overwhelm you with numbers, making your cast a must, and then that leaves them as sitting ducks for a charge attack. There were some mechanics like the cast in Hades 1 that you could just kind of ignore, but in the sequel it felt like I needed to use every part of my arsenal just to get by, and more importantly, I wanted to use all of them. It's just so satisfying to swap between my ranged attacks to soften up enemies, to getting up close and personal with them before dropping my cast when things get overwhelming, trapping them and hitting them with a big charge attack and wiping the board clean in one satisfying swing. And that's all before we even add in all the boons to all of this. There's plenty of returning gods to earn the favor of, like Zeus, Poseidon, and everyone's favorite for totally innocent reasons, Aphrodite, all of which have had their boons reworked to match the new feel of the game, so while there's similarities, I still felt really excited to see the old faces because I want to see their new boons and experiment with them. And of course there's plenty of new gods to get to know, like Hephaestus, who has this really interesting boon for your attacks that'll make them do a ton of damage, but it's on a very long cooldown and it only really hits one person, making you have to really pick your targets. Or Hera, who's almost like the exact opposite. Her boons are often tied to Hitch, a new status effect that makes it so that any damage one enemy takes, the others will also be hit, so long as they have that status effect. I think there was 5 new gods along with 5 or 6 returning ones, all of which were really fun to use and experiment with. But they also added this kind of weird element system. Every boon is now tied to an element, and some boons require a certain amount of one element to activate. Think of them kind of like duo boons, except they can kind of just show up whenever, regardless of if you meet the criteria or not. The thing is, while some were definitely powerful, I never found myself really going for them. It never felt worth it to forgo a boon I knew was good and knew would work with my current build in favor of stacking an element on the chance that I would get the right boon later on. So whenever I got one of those boons, unless I already met the criteria, I never took it. It just felt like a dead boon, a wasted pull. That being said, there aren't a ton of them, so it's not a big deal. But it is an interesting idea that could just use some fleshing out. So between the 5 different weapons in the game, each with 3 aspects to swap between, all the gods and arcana cards to mix and match, not to mention the trinkets. I didn't even mention the trinkets you get from befriended characters. There's a staggering amount of build diversity to wrap your head around, considering it's still not done yet. There's at least one more weapon on the way if the training grounds indicates anything. I found myself doing way more, thinking and engaging with far more systems than the previous game, where I thought I could completely ignore some things like my cast, for example, because I could just spam dash attacks. Combat felt more thoughtful, more varied, but maintained the arcadey feel of the first game. Supergiant Games managed to not only expand on an already incredible system, but polish and improve upon it in almost every way. Like the boss fights, for example, are just so good and felt like a big improvement over Hades 1, which already had great bosses. They managed to feel cinematic, like a scene out of the Odyssey without relying on cutscenes. They're exciting and challenging in a way that gets your heart pounding as you finally beat that boss you've been stuck on for countless runs now with just a sliver of health left, and it makes you want to jump up and cheer. The second boss fight in the game might be one of my favorite boss fights ever, just for how it combines Supergiant Games' great gameplay with its incredible music, and all the bosses feel unique from one another, and I liked how you could learn a little bit about each of them, or their relationship with Melinoe, as you fought them. Like one boss has you fighting 3 enemies at once, but they're all kind of doing their own thing, not really working together, and all have very different fighting styles from one another, with one of them getting very frustrated at the others when they fall, giving us a window into their relationship, but also making the fight interesting as you juggle all 3 enemies. Or how the first boss frames their fight as a training exercise, stopping Melinoe in the middle of her mission to test her, giving you an idea of the type of teacher she is, but also showing how she's both worried for her student because she wants to make sure she's ready, but we still see how much she cares and respects her enough to send her on the mission in the first place. It's interesting, the game is always sprinkling little bits of story and character moments all throughout, and that story is top notch. Granted, it's not finished. This is one of the few parts of the game that's clearly not done because, while you can beat the big bad, there's no satisfying conclusion to it yet. But still, the story of Melinoe trying to save the family she never knew from Kronos as he wages war against the gods was still enrapturing. Seeing her struggle with the task that she's been training her whole life for while others question why she even cares so much when she never even met her family was an interesting take. Melinoe is far more serious than Zagreus ever was, with a far grander goal in mind, with much higher stakes, giving us a very different view of the world. Melinoe, while kind and caring like her brother, is often focused on her mission, so we see tensions arise between her and some of the side characters because of that, in contrast to Zagreus, who clearly maxed out his charisma stat. And all of the characters are as unreasonably sexy and charismatic as befits literal Greek gods. Some even got a redesign that somehow makes them even more attractive, and meeting some of the gods from the first game felt like reuniting with old friends, and all the new characters I just felt like I instantly gelled with. Now, if you were thinking of jumping into Hades 2 without having played the first game, you could probably do it, to be honest, but an awful lot of the driving force does rely on your connection to the original cast, so I'd still recommend playing Hades 1 first, mostly because it's an amazing game. That being said, I did think it was kind of clever that Melinoe never really met her family, because if you haven't played the first game, then you can sort of relate to her and learn about her family and the characters from the first game as she does. And there is so much dialogue in this game, but somehow I never want to skip any of it. All the characters are just so interesting and charismatic that I just want to hear and learn more about them. And when dialogue did pop up, it was usually short and sweet, letting me get back to the gameplay, but would still somehow impart a ton of personality and story. But what was truly impressive about the dialogue was not necessarily the amount, it was how reactive it was. How anytime I came across a character, they would comment on my build or my run, or how they almost beat me that time. They'd express shock when an attack that normally hits misses instead. If there was a boss I was having trouble with and I finally beat them, they'd comment on that. It made the gameplay feel so personal, like there were actual people reacting to the choices I'd made and the things I did in real time. This sort of level of reactivity to the player I've only ever seen in Hades 1, and more recently, Baldur's Gate 3, and that's a massive, sprawling RPG. It felt like anything I did, the game would have a response to it, making the world feel more alive and real in a way that could only ever be achieved in a video game. And of course, you can build relationships with a lot of these side characters in largely the same way as Hades 1, but much like the combat, it has some small changes that make a big difference. In Hades 1, you kind of just gave character gifts. The issue with that was it kind of meant all of your interactions that increased your relationship, at least, were all very transactional feeling. You give them a bunch of these things, they say thank you, and now you kiss. But here, while you do still give them nectar, every now and then you also have to invite them to fish with you or even bathe together instead. And you get a nice little scene where you get to see them just hanging out and talking and getting to know each other. You know, like see their relationship grow and develop more. So they felt like their relationships developed far more naturally, like they actually took the time to get to know each other and become friends with shared interests and experiences, instead of just because you gave them a bunch of drinks. And overall, the game is just paced immaculately. There's always something for you to unlock, to work towards, a new toy to try, or a new story or character moment to chew on. Every run, I would get new crafting materials I could use to unlock something new, but I would also get ashes to improve my character if I did one more run. My crops would finish growing and I could use those, or I'd get more story or nectar to give to one of the side characters to learn more about them. It always felt like I was getting something even when I lost. My time was never wasted. But the game is in early access, so the question remains, how finished is it? What state of development are we paying for right now? Well, it feels pretty damn complete. There's almost twice the amount of content than the first game. Every time I would get to a new area or beat a new boss, I kept expecting the game to end, to see a little screen popping up telling me I reached the end of the early access content and asking me to come back later. But to my surprise and great pleasure, the game just kept going, kept giving me new content, new levels, new weapons, more story and characters. There are some characters that are clearly using placeholder art. You can unlock some areas like a bar and fishing port at your base that feel a little bit underused, and there are a few things that I think could use some balancing, like the torches could maybe do with a touch more damage per shot, and there's currently no customization options for your home base, although that is planned. And of course the main story doesn't have an ending to it yet. But none of that really affected my experience too much. If you told me this was a finished game, I'd believe it. It has enough content in there to justify the purchase and feel satisfying to go through as is. And there's more on the way, at least one more weapon and area. And a few problems I had with the game that did actually bother me have already been fixed with the first update. I originally thought the sprint was a little slow. They increased the speed in the last update. You're still not zooming around, but it's a noticeable change now. And originally you had to unlock and equip specific tools to gather specific resources, but you could only have one equipped at a time. They fixed that too. Now you only need to unlock them, and equipping one just increases the chance of that resource spawning. And how quick they acted to fix these issues really shows just how much they're listening to their fans and how willing they are to make these changes. Hades 2 is already an incredible game worthy of the hype. It launched in early access with more content than some games have in 1.0 and has managed to improve upon a classic. Supergiant Games has once again proven why they're one of the best in the business. If you made it out of this, thank you. I'd appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. And remember,
Death to Kronos.